Today we're continuing our coverage of the failed Chinese real estate developer Evergrande. Back in 2021, they defaulted on an interest payment, causing fears of a Chinese Lehman Brothers situation. 2 long years later, they were finally ordered by a court to be liquidated this past January. This comes as the Chinese authorities announced that the founder, who was once China's richest man and infamous for his super yachts and lavish lifestyle, perpetrated a multi-year $78 billion fraud during the company's final years. For 2 years, Evergrande has been desperately trying to restructure its debts. It was mostly dead, but still just a little bit alive. Now, the courts have finally had enough and ordered the entire company to be liquidated. Millions of ordinary Chinese citizens who paid Evergrande for new homes in advance are now left with nothing but unfinished construction projects. Many of them have lost their life savings. Evergrande's bondholders are expected to get pennies on the dollar if they get anything at all, and the entire liquidation process will almost certainly take many years. In this video, we'll explain how Evergrande's collapse turned into a $78 billion fraud, what the fallout of the disaster means for its customers, employees, and investors, and what it says about the company's billionaire founder. Evergrande, also known as China Evergrande Group, was one of China's largest real estate developers. Its business model was primarily focused on property development, construction, and sales, but it also operated in various unrelated sectors such as electric vehicles, theme parks, and healthcare. Evergrande's core business involved acquiring land, developing residential and commercial properties, and selling them to consumers. The company operated in various tiers of cities around China, targeting both middle-class and affluent consumers. They heavily relied on debt financing to fund their ambitious expansion plans. They often used pre-sales of properties to generate cash flow, allowing them to fund ongoing projects and acquire new land for development. This unique form of leverage effectively saw them borrow money from their future customers. Homebuyers would pay for a home in full upfront, before the home was even built, for the promise that Evergrande would complete construction and deliver the home at some point in the future. In the early years, this leverage allowed them to grow incredibly rapidly. At its peak, the company raked in over $500 billion in revenue per year and employed over 100,000 people. It was one of China's great success stories. In less than 3 years, from 2014 to 2017, the company's market valuation increased almost tenfold, making it one of the most valuable companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange at the time. Despite its rapid growth and expansion, Evergrande faced mounting debt levels, up to $300 billion. As early as 2017, the Chinese government recognized this debt load at Evergrande and other companies as a major risk to the economy, and called on them to deleverage. Despite this, Evergrande and other companies continued to operate at extreme leverage ratios. In 2020, the Chinese government implemented the 3 red lines policy, which consisted of 3 liquidity and equity requirements which were meant to put more stringent limits on borrowing by real estate companies. This policy forced Evergrande to sell much of its assets at massive losses in order to become compliant with the liquidity requirements. This, combined with a general deceleration in the Chinese economy, caused losses so great that they were eventually unable to pay their creditors. In late 2021, they missed a multi-million-dollar interest payment. Evergrande's stock price plummeted over 90%, and it faced numerous protests from homebuyers and investors, demanding refunds and payments. They spent the next 2 years negotiating with their creditors, trying to restructure their massive debt burden. In late 2023, the situation took an entirely new direction. It went from a story of a company that grew too fast and collapsed under its own debt load, to a potentially massive fraud case. In September of that year, the founder of Evergrande, Hui Ka-yan, was put under police surveillance while being investigated for quote, illegal crimes, unquote. Hui, who grew up from humble beginnings, was well known throughout China as an extravagant spender. Due to his company's success, he became the richest man in China, with an estimated net worth over $40 billion US. He became a symbol of extreme wealth, flying around the world in private jets and buying mega yachts. But with the collapse of Evergrande, the Chinese authorities became suspicious of the means by which he built his real estate empire. By early 2023, there were signs that the epic collapse of Evergrande might not have been just an unfortunate business failure, but the result of an effort to deceive regulators, investors, and millions of homeowners. One of the first red flags came in January of 2023, when Evergrande's auditor, PwC, resigned. They said that they were unable to complete their work with Evergrande. When an auditor of a company refuses to complete an audit of a public company, that is often a sign that the company has refused to provide adequate financial information to the auditor. That's a common precursor to some of the world's most infamous accounting and financial scandals. At this point, the China Securities Regulatory Commission had become involved in investigating the company. A new auditing company, the much smaller Prism Hong Kong and Shanghai, was brought in to complete the Evergrande audit. They uncovered a massive hole in the company's financials. Over $70 billion of revenue reported by the company over the prior several years didn't exist. In early 2024, the Chinese regulators accused founder Hui Ka-yan of perpetrating a massive fraud designed to artificially prop up Evergrande's increasingly unsustainable business model. According to the accusations, the company, at the direction of Hui, inflated their reported revenue by almost $30 billion in 2019 and another almost $40 billion in 2020. They did this by treating prepayments by home buyers as revenue, even though the corresponding homes had not yet been built. Based on standard accounting principles, this should not count as revenue until the final product has been delivered to the buyer. Doing this gave Evergrande the perception that the company was making much more money than it really was. Evergrande did this not to fix any underlying problems at the company. You can't make a problem go away just by reporting an extra $70 billion. Instead, they used this fake revenue to raise billions of dollars of additional capital from unsuspecting investors and homebuyers over the following 2 to 3 years. They ultimately would default on much of this capital. Aside from the astronomical numbers attached to the catastrophe, the Chinese regulators are particularly concerned with the fraud because some of the biggest victims are ordinary homebuyers. Remember that one way Evergrande used debt to finance its construction projects was by taking advance payments from homebuyers. People would pay Evergrande for apartments that had not yet been built. When the real estate market in China started cooling and Evergrande became unable to service its debt, millions of people lost their life savings. Even Evergrande's own employees weren't safe from the scheme. In order for the company to increase liquidity, their wealth management business pitched short-term, high-interest investment products to their employees and customers. When the rest of the company started to crumble, they announced that they would not be able to make their payments on these investment products. When the company finally could not honor withdrawals from its employees and customers, there were mass protests at the company's headquarters. Chinese authorities arrested several of the wealth management business executives, pending investigations. This past March, Chinese regulators fined the company over $500 million over the debacle, and Hui Ka-yan personally millions more. According to the regulators, Hui orchestrated the fraud by instructing his staff to, quote, falsely increase the performance, unquote, of the business in 2019 and 2020. This allowed the company to report a profit of about $1 billion in 2020, when in reality they should have reported a multi-billion-dollar loss. This false reality helped them to raise billions of dollars in capital over the next couple years. They raised $500 million in a secondary offering on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in 2020, and almost $5 billion selling shares to various state-linked companies in China. Throughout 2020 and 2021, they continued to sell their shares of various business entities for billions of dollars, including a small stake in their electric vehicle business, which they sold for over $1 billion. They even enticed ordinary Chinese homebuyers with a nationwide 30% discount promotion on all real estate properties in an effort to boost sales and pay down debt. At this point, Mr. Hui almost certainly knew the company was a house of cards, and was trying to take advantage of whatever confidence the market still had in Evergrande to raise as much money as possible. Ultimately, the many billions of dollars that he did raise proved not to be enough. From 2021, when Evergrande first started defaulting on its debts, to 2023, the company engaged in negotiations with its creditors and the courts to restructure its liabilities. Many people hoped that the Chinese government would bail out the company, much like the US bank bailout in 2008. The hope was that because Evergrande was so interwoven into the lives of ordinary people and such a large part of the Chinese economy, that the government would consider them too big to fail. But after 2 years, it finally reached the end of the line. Instead of saving Evergrande, the government laid the blame squarely on Evergrande, with the arrest of founder Hui Ka-yan in September of 2023. 4 months later, a judge in Hong Kong ordered Evergrande to liquidate, meaning the inevitable end of the company. The firm Alvarez & Marsal Asia will oversee the sale of the company's assets, which will then be distributed to the stakeholders. Evergrande stock finally stopped trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in January. Unlike when it was first suspended in 2022 for 17 months, this time it will likely never trade on an exchange again. With the company under the control of liquidators, the question is now what will happen to the remaining assets, as well as the millions of housing units still yet to be built. There are about $300 billion of liabilities and an estimated $240 billion of assets, according to Reuters. Most of the assets have been taken over by local authorities in mainland China. A recent comparison is the 2020 liquidation of HNA Group, a Chinese conglomerate with investments in all sorts of businesses. They became over-leveraged in the late 2010s, similar to Evergrande, and were forced to liquidate in 2020 to pay back almost $200 billion of liabilities. Creditors that were owed less than about $15,000 were mostly made whole, but anyone big enough to be owed more than that generally suffered huge losses. If the Evergrande liquidation follows a similar framework, homebuyers who were left on the hook for unfinished apartments started by Evergrande will likely be the first to receive compensation. After the homebuyers, the liquidation will likely prioritize other customers of Evergrande's various businesses, employees, construction contractors who have not been paid for their work, government and domestic creditors, and lastly, foreign creditors. However, there may not be enough even to pay back the homebuyers. The investment bank Nomura estimates that there are 20 million unfinished housing units across China, many of which are Evergrande's projects. It's unclear whether Evergrande's $240 billion in assets remaining would even cover their portion of this liability. It will take years for the authorities to sort out each individual homebuyer situation and determine the payouts. In the meantime, the Chinese government has made it a policy priority that people who paid for their homes will have their homes delivered. In the city of Shijiazhuang, the local government took over 44 unfinished housing projects in 2021. Earlier this year, they announced that most of them had been completed. Nationwide, the Chinese Housing Ministry has already delivered over 1 million units left unfinished by defunct real estate developers. Many of Evergrande's unfinished projects will continue work while the liquidation is happening, potentially putting the government on the hook for any funding gap. While this means that homebuyers will likely eventually be made whole, there may not be anything left from the liquidation for other stakeholders, including employees, contractors, and investors. Expectations are that bondholders will end up getting 2 to 3 pennies on the dollar, if they get anything at all. Yet another complication in the liquidation is the fact that Evergrande was ordered to liquidate by a Hong Kong court, but the vast majority of its assets are located in mainland China. Back in 2021, China and Hong Kong agreed to mutually recognize liquidation orders on either side. By this agreement, any liquidations ordered by Hong Kong of assets based in the Chinese cities of Shanghai, Xiamen, or Shenzhen will be honored. However, Evergrande's assets extend far beyond these 3 cities. Given the political consequences of Evergrande's collapse, the Chinese government may be less willing to allow assets to flow from the mainland to Hong Kong. Homebuyers are already understandably furious about not getting the homes they paid for when the company collapsed. If the government allows foreign or even Hong Kong-based investors to be paid before all homebuyers are made whole, the situation will become even worse. So despite the Hong Kong courts ordering Evergrande to liquidate, Hong Kong-based investors will likely be at the end of the line to get anything from the liquidation. That is, if there's anything left for them at that point at all. The multi-year unraveling of China's largest and most important real estate developer is far from over, but the last glimmer of hope of salvaging the company has finally gone out. There are any number of different causes that one could blame the disaster on. Too many years of low interest rates encouraging rampant leverage, the Chinese government being too slow to catch on to the situation, or the 3 red lines policy being too extreme once the government finally did realize a deleveraging was needed. But at the core, the story of Evergrande shares the same origins of the world's biggest business failures and frauds. A man from humble beginnings bets everything on the right industry, in the right country, at the right time, and ends up becoming one of the richest men in China. To keep the success going, he sets out on an obscene, multi-decade debt-fueled expansion, eventually imploding under its own weight. In a desperate attempt to save his fortune, he paints a false reality to entice new capital from unsuspecting customers and investors. They are ultimately the ones who pay the price. The cleanup of the aftermath will take many years, and it was ultimately caused by the exact same thing that caused Theranos, Enron, Bernie Madoff, and countless other disasters: greed. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Evergrande? Do you think the disaster could have been avoided? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.